Impact of IMF. According to a 2002 study of the Randall W. Stone, the academic literature on the IMF shows no consensus on a long-term efforts of IMF program on growth. Criticism. Overseas Development Institute (ODI) research undertaken in the 1980s, including criticism of the IMF, with which support the analysis that it is a pillar of the what activities Titus Alexander calls global apartheid. Developed countries were seen to have a more dominant role and control over less developed countries. LDCs, the fund, worked on the incorrect assumptions that all payments disequilibria were caused domestically. The Group of 24 G24 on behalf of LDC member and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development UNCTAD complained that the IMF did not distinguish sufficiently between the disequilibria with the predominantly external as opposed to initial cause. This criticism was voiced in the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis. Then LDCs fund themselves with the payment of deficits due to adverse changes in their terms of the trade with the fund prescribed stabilization program similar to those suggested for deficit caused by the government. Our spending faced with the long-term externally generated disequilibria. The G24 argue for the more time for LDCs to adjust their economies. Some IMF policies may be anti-developmental. The report said that deflationary efforts of IMF program quickly led to the losses of output and employment in economies where income were low and unemployment was high. Moreover, the burden of the deflation is disproportionately borne by the poor. The IMF initially policies were based in theory and influenced by the differing opinion and departmental rivalries. Critics suggest that it is intention to implement these policies in countries with their widely varying economic circumstances were misinformed and lack economic rational. ODI conclusion were that the IMF's very nature of promoting market-oriented approaches attracts unavoidable criticism. On the other hand, the IMF could serve as a scapegoat while allowing governments to blame international bankers. The ODI considered that the IMF was incentive to the political aspirations of LDCs while its policy conditions were inflexible. Argentina, which had been considered by the IMF to be a model country in its comprehensive to policy proposal by the Bretton Woods Institution, experienced a catastrophic economic crisis in 2001, which some believe to have been caused by the IMF, included budget restrictions which undercut the government's ability to sustain national infrastructure even in crucial areas such as health, education and security, and privatization of strategically vital nation resources. Other attributes the crisis into Argentina misdesigned fiscal federalism, which causes subnational spending to increase rapidly. The crisis added to the widespread hatred of this institution in Argentina and other South American countries, with many blaming the IMF for the region's economic problem. The current, as of early 2006, trend toward the moderate left-wing governments in the region and a growing concern with the development of a regional economic policies largely independent of the big businesses. Pressures has been ascribed to this crisis. In 2006, a senior action aid policy analysis Akasha Marpithia stated that the IMF policy in Africa undermine any possibilities of meeting the Millennium Development Goals due to the imposed restriction that prevent spending on the important sectors such as education and health. In an interview, the former Romanian Prime Minister Călin Popescu Tăriceanu claimed that since 2005, IMF is constantly making mistakes when it appreciated the country economy's performance. Former Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, who claimed that the debt-ridden African states were ceding sovereignty to the IMF and the World Bank, famously asked who elected the IMF to be Minister of the Finance for every country in the world. former chief economist of IMF and former Reserve Bank of India Governor Raghuram Rajan, who predicted financial crisis of 2007-2008, criticized IMF for the remaining a sideline player to the developed world. He criticized IMF for praising monetary policies of the US, which he believed were wreaking havoc in the emerging market. He had been critical of the ultra losing money policies of the Western nation and IMF countries. Countries such as Zambia have not received proper aid, with the long-lasting efforts lending to the concern from the economists. Since 2005, Zambia as well as 29 other African countries did receive debt write-offs, which helped with the country's medical and the educational funds. However, Zambia returned to a debt of the over half its GDP in less than a decade. American economist William Easterly, skeptical of the IMF method, had initially warned that debt relief would simply encourage more recklessly borrowing by corrupt government unless it was accompanied by the reform to speed up economic growth and the improved governance, according to the economist.